Anyone who comes into the orbit of Boris Johnson tends to emerge, damaged. And it took me a long time to recover from having worked with him. I mean, it was a pretty traumatic experience. He's a pretty scary man, actually, when he's angry and there's only one woman in the office with him. He is intimidating, imposing, and quite sort of aggressive. I wouldn't wish that on anyone, and I think, again, like I say, the nearer you get to him, the less you like him. The other thing, of course, you should know about Boris Johnson, and I know this from personal experience, is that if you do ever end up in a pub with him, and he used to come into the Irish pub in Brussels called Petit O'Shea, he used to pump everyone for information, by the way, not to socialise, he would never, ever, ever buy a round, ever. And I'm not sure he's ever been known in the history of the universe to buy a round. So don't go to the pub with Boris Johnson.
Sonia Purnell, hello.
Hello.
How's it going?
Okay.
Good. You are a journalist and also the author of Just Boris, a biography about Boris Johnson.
Yes.
It's a fitting time for us to be speaking. Let's start with how you met. When did you first meet Boris Johnson?
I think it was 1992, and I was going out to be his deputy in Brussels. We were both reporting on the European Union, or European Community as it was then, for the Telegraph. I'd only ever been to Brussels once before for about 3 hours to look for a flat, but he was, Brussels kind of royalty, if you like. He'd grown up there, he'd gone to school there, he'd been working there for some years, and I didn't really know much more about him than that, but my goodness, it was quite a shock when I met him.
How did he behave towards you?
Bizarrely. I arrived at the office. I had to go and cover something that John Major was doing. He was in town, then Prime Minister, and I said, where is this place? I've got to do it. And he said, go to the Rue de la Loire and keep going to the end. So I did, and it was raining and it was dark and I was running and I was going to be late, and I got to the end of this road and it wasn't there at all. It was somewhere almost next door to our office. So of course I arrived late, flustered, incredibly unprofessional, and in complete bafflement as to why would you do that to someone? Really bizarre.
How did things progress from then? Was that a marker of things to come? Did he warm to you after that?
I mean, there were occasional times when, I'd make a coffee in the kitchen and I'd offer him one, and we had a secretary who came in every now and again, and she left these chocolates in the cupboard. They're very nice ones, and Belgian chocolate. And I'd offer him one, and I'd try to be a good colleague, but he was really strange from the start. I mean, he would lock his door so I couldn't get to the messages on the answer phone. We only had one. In those days, you had messages on a phone. He didn't introduce me to anyone. He made my life very difficult. I mean, very, very difficult.
Were there signs back then that he had designs on something greater? Did you feel like journalism was a platform, or do you think it was something that he was actually significantly interested in and saw a career in?
He wanted to be the top dog in journalism, so that was absolutely clear. But what was also clear to me, getting to know him pretty well. I mean, we were only two in this office, and we were working pretty long hours. A lot of stuff was going on in Brussels at the time. It became clear to me that he had huge ambitions. My book's called A Tale of Blonde Ambition. He wanted to be the ultra top dog, which obviously isn't being a journalist anymore, it's being a politician and ultimately Prime Minister. And in fact, I wrote a piece in 2002, saying, this is inviting people to imagine him on the steps of Downing Street. And everyone said I was bonkers and crazy and what a ridiculous idea. He wasn't ambitious at all. But of course he was. I mean, it was so evident. I mean, he was ruthless. Way back then, he was ruthless and focused.
I was going to ask you whether there are any particular character traits that stand out to you in hindsight, and it sounds like perhaps being ruthless is one of them.
Yes, he is the most ruthless person I've ever met, or probably will ever meet. I mean, utterly ruthless, very secretive as well. Doesn't like any sort of compartment of his life being looked at by another compartment of his life. So, and not a team player. I mean, I'm very much a team player. I love being part of a team, but he wanted, I think that's what it was all about, was basically he didn't want to play in the same team as not just me, but anybody. I mean, he does this kind of stuff to other people too.
Ruthless and secretive, and then you decide to write a biography about him.
Yeah.
So how did that go down?
Well, I tried to do it all in the best possible way. Hello, Boris. I'm going to write a book about you, and really like to have a chat. And he said, he said, well, if you get a deal, a bit of hair messing. if you get a deal, we'll have lunch. So I said, that's excellent. I think perhaps he thought I wasn't going to get a deal. He was kind of quite, he was always kind of squashing, other people that they couldn't possibly do things. Anyway, I did get a deal, so I called him out, hey, Boris, let's have lunch. And it never happened. I mean, I had meetings with lots of people who are very close to him and were very close to him then, and who told me, look, he just doesn't know how to deal with you. He doesn't know how to deal with women. He doesn't particularly know how to deal with women who don't fancy him, which I certainly did not, or, women who aren't part of a particular tribe. I mean, I wasn't part of the Labour tribe or any other tribe. He couldn't get at me that way. So he smeared me instead, which was pretty unpleasant.
We'll come onto his relationship with women in a moment, but just on those sort of character traits we were discussing, do you think he's qualified to be Prime Minister? Do you think he's a good candidate for the job?
No. I mean, I actually can't think of anyone who's less suited to that job. I mean, let's have a look at the qualities we'd like in a Prime Minister. I mean, I would go for maybe integrity and competence. I mean, they seem to be pretty good things to have in a Prime Minister. Well, integrity, I think we've seen pretty much forever that, it doesn't seem to exist. And competence, look, they brag about the vaccine programme. Okay, I mean, it's been not bad. I admit that. Other countries have done it better. It's been pretty good here. But our overall death rate is awful. My mother died from COVID in the most appalling circumstances. We've lost tens and tens of thousands of people we didn't need to lose. We locked down too late. We didn't, follow the science in the way that we should have done. And not only that, but our economic hit was worse than any others. And when they say that, we're the fastest growing economy in the G7, that's only true over a certain period, and only true because we went much further down than any other G7 economy, and our recovery is stalling. So no integrity, no competence, shifty, and a lack of respect for other people. And maybe that's the most important thing of all. He's the man with access to nuclear codes. He's the man who can put us in prison with new laws, who can take money away with us with new taxes, who can send our army to fight in new wars. And yet he has no respect for us and no integrity and no competence. How scary is that? I find it quite difficult to sleep at night, and I think we all should, frankly.
It's quite alarming when you put it like that. On this point of integrity, what kind of political journey do you think he's been on in terms of if he has an ideology at all? Because obviously he's elected Mayor of London, he's seen as quite a liberal essentially, and obviously he's transitioned now to a really quite socially conservative Brexiteer Prime Minister. Do you think that speaks to a sort of lack of guiding political ideology, or is there something else there?
Well, he was once asked, don't you have any convictions at all? And he cut straight back, yes, one for speeding, but that was a long time ago. I mean, yeah, it was quite a funny joke actually, but well, at least not a bad one. But I mean, also quite revealing. I mean, look, there is one huge conviction, which is the greater glorification of Boris Johnson. But in terms of any other ideology, it doesn't really exist. I mean, he is a Remainer. I wish people would kind of realise this. I mean, having worked with him in Brussels when he was writing those virulent anti-European stories, he had to work himself up into a massive frenzy by swearing at this yucca plant. Believe me, this is all true, it's all in the book, for about 10 minutes to get himself riled up so that he could write this nonsense, because he knew it was nonsense, but it was convenient for him at the time to write this because no one else was doing it. So, I mean, he went for leave because it was better for his career at that particular time, would like to make him Prime Minister, which of course it has. But deep down, he's hugely European. His DNA is Europe. He speaks various languages. He's much more at home, in a way, in Brussels than he is in London.
Final question on this point of, well, maybe a couple on this point of integrity. There's a lot there. He's surrounded by this kind of Partygate scandal right now, and a lot of the people we've been interviewing have been sharing stories about what they were doing at the time when Johnson was at a party in the Downing Street garden, or having a birthday cake brought in for him. What were you doing?
The day before, I was burying my mother. So on the 19th, we had a funeral for her. We were only allowed 10 people. Those were the rules at the time. So a lot of the family couldn't come. None of her friends and relations could come. So it's a very small group of us. I remember the weather was absolutely stunning, and I handed out a white peony to all of us, 10 of us had a white peony. We weren't allowed to touch her coffin. We were allowed to put the flowers near her coffin, She died in a care home because they were releasing people from hospital straight into her care home with no testing. So a lot of them obviously positive. Everyone on her floor in the care home died. I hadn't seen her since March except on a screen. My story is, I'm sure, no worse than many others. In fact, I'm sure a lot of people have even worse stories. And probably we would still do the same. But we assumed, and we were entitled to assume, that those who were setting these rules were obeying them and were actually respecting the suffering and the sacrifices that we were all, making for the greater good. And I think that's why this scandal has cut through. I mean, he's a scandal a minute man, but this one cut through because it is about our hearts and our souls and what we are as people, and that lack of respect is a killer.
I'm so sorry, Sonia, to hear that story. It's hard to hear. And you're right, I think, to flag that there are many stories like that, pointing out the various scandals that he's been able to duck the consequences of. Do you think this is the one that does for him in the end?
I don't know. I mean, I've been someone who's seen all these scandals year after year and been continually astonished at how indulged he's always been, how people have forgiven him. But I do sense that this one is different because it's easy to understand and it goes to people's real heartfelt emotions, and you hear the anger out there and the sorrow about it. Okay, that might be not sustainable forever, but people will never forget it, I think. And I think now people have got closer to Boris Johnson. I think the thing about him is the closer you get, the more you get to know him, the less you like him. And now people are getting to know who he really is.
Something that speaks to that quality of people getting close to him and realising about him. His time as editor of The Spectator is quite informative.
Yeah, I mean, his regime at Downing Street reminds me of the Spectator regime very much. I mean, that was party. The night of 7/7, when over 50 people were killed in London by terrorist attacks, the Spectator was due to have its summer party, and now we're told that he was really gung-ho and wanted to go ahead. It was only others who said, no, this has to stop, but he wanted to have that party. That's what I mean, there's no kind of empathy with other people, there's no kind of recognition of what's actually appropriate, or, compassion. Compassion seems completely lacking here, but the whole thing was chaotic and he was hardly ever around, and people couldn't find him, and everyone was having affairs with everybody else, and that's his kind of that's his natural habitat. Okay, fine, in a magazine it got get known as the Sextator, sorry. But we're talking about Downing Street in time of national crisis, not only COVID, but all the disastrous fallout of Brexit. So many companies struggling out there, lorry drivers stuck on roads for hours on end, families separated, the whole COVID thing on top of that. This country is in an existential crisis, and what's he doing? Having parties every 5 minutes against the rules.
And obviously, Petrova Wyatt was employed at The Spectator at that time as well.
Well, I mean, they had... she was just one of many different affairs, but I mean, it's interesting how he burns these women's lives. I mean, she was pregnant and a couple of times, never went ahead and had those babies, has never had children. Someone else he did have an affair with did have a love child by him. Other women were pursued by the media and had a really difficult time. One I know had to sort of change her name, the colour of her hair and everything. Anyone who comes into the orbit of Boris Johnson tends to emerge damaged, and it took me a long time to recover from having worked with him. I mean, it was a pretty traumatic experience. He's a pretty scary man, actually, when he's angry and there's only one woman in the office with him. He is intimidating, imposing, and quite sort of aggressive. I wouldn't wish that on anyone, and I think, again, like I say, the nearer you get to him, the less you like him.
Only need to listen to that phone call with Darius Guppy, don't you, to kind of be informed about what that can be like.
Well, I'm quite pleased that tape has emerged again. I mean, I think that was going on when I was there. Maybe the reason why he always locked up the telephone and I could never use it, because goodness knows what else was on there.
Just a quick one. All these parties, Downing Street, The Spectator, Do you know Boris Johnson to be a big drinker?
He never was. I don't know more recently whether he's picked up drinking, but he never was. He never liked that feeling of loss of control. He's very cunning. He's always sort of looking around for the main chance and things, and he'd quite like it when others did lose control. However, he used to pretend when he was fluffing up an interview that he had a hangover when you knew precisely he'd probably had, one half of a pint of beer. The other thing, of course, you should know about Boris Johnson, and I know this from personal experience, is that if you do ever end up in a pub with him, and he used to come into the Irish pub in Brussels called Kitty O'Shea, he used to pump everyone for information, by the way, not to socialise. He would never, ever, ever buy a round, ever. And I'm not sure he's ever been known in the history of the universe to buy a round. So don't go to the pub with Boris Johnson if he asks you.
There's an advantage to being the most sober person in the room, isn't there?
Yes, you learn, you manoeuvre, you win. It's all about winning.
So Johnson manages to keep his editorship of The Spectator, despite lying to its proprietor, Conrad Black. He gets it on the condition that he won't seek elected office. He does, he gets it, he somehow manages to stay in
And then he tells his constituency that he won't go on being editor of The Spectator, but he does. But everyone forgives him, kind of.
Two instances where that hasn't happened at the Times and also Michael Howard's Conservative Party. So do you think those are examples of actually the consequences of his actions catching up with him?
Yeah, but not for very long. So he lied at the Times and got sacked by the really kind of tough Glaswegian editor of the time. Interestingly, there's kind of a class thing going on here too, that some people from sort of less gilded background than Boris Johnson see through him. So Charlie Wilson was certainly one of those, and so he sacked him after making up all these quotes. But Max Hastings, very much from the same kind of class, public school boy, immediately picked him up as he thought, this brilliant young person. So he was out of work for, 5 minutes or something. And then with Michael Howard, again, it was a sort of the more kind of punchy, non-public school boys who saw through him, got fed up with the lies, and he was consequently sacked. But again, it didn't really affect his career. It was a slight sort of hiatus maybe, but no more than that.
Some viewers might wonder why we're talking about events sort of 20, 30 years ago, but to me it seems there's a really obvious pattern of behaviour, of deception, duplicitousness, self-interest that really seems quite familiar to what's going on now.
Yes. I mean, when I wrote the book, charting his life, it was the same stuff again and again and again, like you say, duplicity, selfishness, secretiveness, a real eye for money, by the way, and massive expensive claims and all that kind of thing when he was a journalist. His character was completely formed, and so nothing has surprised me at all during his career, not even getting to Downing Street. Like I say, I kind of predicted that back in 2002. What has surprised me and deeply depressed me is how other people haven't seen through it. I mean, I've spent a decade of my life trying to warn people about this bloke called Boris Johnson. Please don't believe it. But people wanted, I think, to believe it. They thought he was a sort of charming, classically trained teddy bear, couldn't possibly be, dangerous. Of course, he is, and nothing surprised me apart from the fact that more people didn't see through it and that they indulged him. Employers, wives, voters, sadly.
Speculative question, but it's quite possible that history does not look back kindly on Boris Johnson. How do you think he'll feel about that?
Well, he'll be very disappointed. He'll think, oh, well, I was the Prime Minister who took us out of Europe, although actually I think he really wishes that he hadn't. But, so he will be in the history books for that reason, and I think probably in 20 years' time, 10 years' time, people say, well, what the hell was everyone thinking about doing that? But anyway, he has done that. But I think otherwise history will be very harsh on him. I mean, look at the mess this country's in. So divided, depressed, schools in the state, hospitals in the state, transport in the state, the economy in the state. We've never probably been as divided as we are now. The amount of hatred and anger out there. And he's presided over all of this, the complete collapse in standards in public life, so that lying is now, almost expected. That wasn't the case not that long ago, and look how a once great country has completely fallen. I travel abroad a lot for work, and it depresses me beyond words to hear what people now think about us, and that's down to him.
I guess in some ways the minutiae of policy, the details, they're for the little people.
Yeah, I mean, he's not interested in policy. He's a politician who's not interested in policy. I mean, he has no vision for the country at all. It was all about becoming Prime Minister, becoming, not about being Prime Minister. I mean, Gordon Brown obviously had many flaws, but he did have a great sort of thing about what he wanted to do. I mean, Tony Blair the same, maybe Cameron to some extent, Major. Most other Prime Ministers do have this kind of, whether you agree with it or not, they have something that they really want to do with the country. He doesn't give a toss. He just wants to be Prime Minister and have people put up hideous wallpaper at someone else's expense.
Sonia Purnell, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.